Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here for this legislative briefing on the results of a new fracking poll. I just want you to know that this virtual briefing is being recorded, and that has started now. My name is Ginny Marcel Kerslake, and I am the Eastern Pennsylvania organizer for Food and Water Watch. I am joined today by Joanne Kilgour, Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute, who commissioned this poll. Joanne will be presenting the poll findings, followed by remarks from Senator Katie Muth and Representative Danielle Friel Otten. There will be an opportunity afterwards to ask any questions that you may have. A groundbreaking new opinion poll that by large margins showed that by large margins, Pennsylvanians across the political spectrum support a serious crackdown on fracking operations. The poll is unique in that it reveals which specific regulations Pennsylvanians support and oppose. These findings paint a clear picture for legislators and other state officials of what actions their constituents want to see them take. Today, you will hear how clear majorities oppose subsidies for fossil fuel corporations and support clean energy initiatives. How the recommendations of Attorney General Shapiro's grand jury investigation into fracking's public health threats are also broadly popular. How overwhelmingly Pennsylvanian voters are concerned about air and water pollution, and how a large and bipartisan majority are concerned about fracking waste, and the majority want to end fracking altogether. Pennsylvanians are experiencing in real time the impacts of fracking and fossil fuels on our climate, the health and safety of our communities, and our families. These devastating impacts on the environment and your constituents require Pennsylvania state legislators to act now to strengthen restrictions on fracking. This poll shows that Pennsylvanian voters across the political spectrum strongly support these actions. I am pleased to now introduce Joanne Kilgour from the Ohio River Valley Institute, who will present the poll findings.
Thank you so much, Ginny, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm just going to try to share my screen here quickly. All right. So, Ginny, are you seeing the presentation? Excellent. So thanks very much for that introduction. I'm Joanne Kilgour, the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute, and we're a new think tank for the kind of northern part of Appalachia in the Ohio River Valley, focusing on Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And our purpose really is to produce data-driven research and propose policies that focus on economic development and standards of living to improve shared prosperity, clean energy, and a more equitable democracy. So just quickly about the poll. This poll was conducted earlier this spring by the firm Data for Progress, and they used a web panel respondents and weighted the sample to be representatives of likely voters by age, gender, education, race, and voting history. We initially presented these results in July and are, very pleased by the reception that they've received so far, and we're excited to get into more detail here this morning. So the key takeaways from the report are, the first is that the Attorney General's recommendations were supported by overwhelming numbers of Pennsylvania voters across the party spectrum. And subsidies for fossil fuels are very unpopular, but public spending on clean energy is very popular. Clean energy and environmental advocates are far more popular than fossil fuel interests. That one surprised me. Some of you may know that I was the director and lobbyist for the Sierra Club's Pennsylvania chapter before this, and it didn't always feel this way. And by wide margins, Pennsylvania voters support a major crackdown on fracking, which is something that I think we're really seeing the more that we talk to community members, that the conversation around impacts has become so pervasive that there really has been this big shift in opinion toward voters really wanting to see this crackdown. And also large and bipartisan majorities of Pennsylvania voters are really concerned about fracking waste and want to strengthen protections. So the fracking waste issue is another one that, you know, touches across all geographies within the state and has started to become an increasingly serious issue for many residents. The vast majority of Pennsylvania voters are concerned about air and water pollution. And finally, the last key takeaway, well, we'll get there in the end, but the last key takeaway is just that, you know, there's a tremendous amount of support for additional regulation, and that, you know, voters are really shifting their perspective over time to be more and more concerned about fracking and really wanting to see a phase out. So the first key takeaway is that the Attorney General's recommendations are supported by overwhelming numbers of Pennsylvania voters. And we actually broke this question out into these subsets here. So you can see that, you know, support just continued to grow as we went down through these recommendations. So allowing the Attorney General's office to prosecute oil and gas companies, limiting this kind of revolving door that we've seen between politicians in appointed and elected office and fracking companies, air pollution, requiring disclosures of chemical use, conducting a comprehensive health report. So again, this health and transport of waste you see are really, really high on the minds of Pennsylvania voters, and just extreme support here. You know, these numbers are very, very high for this kind of polling assessment. And I think it just speaks to the effectiveness of the grand jury process, and then also the saliency of these recommendations. So the next is that subsidies for fossil fuels are very unpopular. So, you know, we had two questions that were really trying to get into the subsidies, and one of them focused on the petrochemical side of things. So do you agree or disagree that petrochemical plants that make plastic products out of fracked gas, like the Shell ethylene cracker, should receive tax breaks or subsidies from the state government? And we see that, you know, a significant portion disagree with that. And that's a very an indication that these kind of subsidies are very unpopular. But in contrast, public spending on clean energy is very popular. So this question was framed to identify how the voters are thinking about investments in new infrastructure and clean energy projects. And we see this 77% is such a strong indication that there's a lot of interest in public investments in new infrastructure and clean energy. So then one of the other key points that we took away from this, from these results, was that you know, we broke down this question around kind of favorable opinion of industry and different advocates. And one of the interesting things is that the polling firm asked both about the fracking industry and the oil and gas industry, and you can see the difference there. So in some cases, you know, we've talked about how the public differentiates between this concern around fracking versus, you know, what's often kind of softer in terms of oil and gas industry, and you can see that in the favorability ratings here. So whereas the plastics industry and the fracking industry have relatively low favorability at the bottom, environmental advocates in the clean energy industry, we see a majority have a significantly stronger favorable opinion. And then here we see that by really wide margins, Pennsylvania voters support a major crackdown on fracking. So the way the question was framed was, the state government needs to do a better job of cracking down on fracking companies that do not comply with regulations, versus the state does not need to intervene and impose more bureaucratic regulations on fracking companies. And 61% is a really large number to see here for emphasizing the need for the state to do a better job of cracking down on fracking companies and really focused on heightened regulation. So we also see that large and bipartisan majorities of Pennsylvania voters are concerned about fracking waste. And again, this is an issue that you may either have already heard about or will be hearing more about from constituents and from other members of your caucus, where fracking fluids are exempt from hazardous waste safeguards currently. And this is something that, we're seeing public health impacts, land impacts, impacts to local residents, and that's really showing up here in these numbers. So where 69% of the respondents indicated that they agree with removing this exemption, even when we break that down by different party respondents, we can see that Democrats, independents, and Republicans all strongly favor removing this exemption and really strengthening protections around hazardous waste. And so, looking at air and water pollution, so this is something we all come back to, it's part of Article 1, Section 27 of the state constitution. And again, just such a clear indication of how top of mind this is for residents of Pennsylvania and for our constituents, that 86% of Pennsylvania voters are concerned about air pollution. And again, regardless of party, that breaks down where we see Democrats, independents, and Republicans, again, all having an incredibly high degree of concern about air pollution. And that just gets even higher when we talk about our water pollution. So 90% of Pennsylvania voters concerned about water pollution. And again, it's irrespective of party affiliation. So when we connect back the issues that we're talking about on the environment, on climate, and on fracking, on petrochemicals, we see that predominantly there are concerns driven by local air and water pollution. And so also a majority of Pennsylvania voters want to end fracking. Pennsylvania voters have become increasingly skeptical about the benefits of fracking and increasingly concerned about its impacts. The way these questions were structured, the results were that, less than half of state voters agree that the economic benefits of fracking outweigh the environmental costs. So that's a big shift from where we started even, 10, 15 years ago. I know when I first started working in southwestern Pennsylvania with a lot of community members who had been impacted by fracking or were confronting the decision of whether or not to lease their land, this number was at a very different point. And so as the industry has continued to operate in the state, we're seeing now that, fewer than half of state voters are seeing the economic benefit outweighing the cost. And only 19% of voters say that they've heard mostly positive things about the impact of fracking on private lands. So a big focus has been around, the rights of private landowners and different community conversations around leasing and impacts of leasing. And now that we're, again, this far into the industry operating in the state, only 19% of voters are saying that they're hearing positive things, whereas 36% are saying that what they've heard is mostly negative. And the number is even smaller when we move to public lands. So thinking about all of our spaces that DCNR operates and local municipalities or counties, we see that just 14% of state voters have heard mostly positive things about fracking on public lands, whereas 42% say that what they've heard is mostly negative. So this is just an indication of where voters currently are, the increased concern around the environmental cost and the impact on both private and public lands, and really wanting to see this practice phased out for the state. So in the chat, I think we're going to put a link to a digital toolkit. So if you're moved by anything that you've heard here or surprised by any of these statistics, we have some additional materials that go into details for the poll, provide additional questions and responses where these charts are made shareable. So if you're interested in either sharing this with your constituents or posting anywhere on your social media profiles, we've made that available. And then I think we're going to do questions at the very end. Is that right, Ginny? So I will stop my screen share. And yeah, thank you so much. So that was the overview of the results. And now I'll pass it back to you, Ginny.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for all of your work on this poll. I will now turn it over to Senator Katie Muth for her remarks.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Food and Water, to Ginny and Joanne. This I know is a important issue to us, but to share this polling that shows that this is important to people living all across our Commonwealth is valuable, especially from a legislative standpoint on messaging on our priorities and what we need to push harder for. And also, Joanne, to your point, what we may have thought have been the mindset of some of the people in Pennsylvania, I think this is great data to show that the public health piece is really like a crucial part of this in terms of our ability to serve the public as representatives who are elected and get some of these things done, because the concern isn't just from quote unquote tree hugging radical, whatever the terminology is often used to be divisive, is that this is a real concern for residents in all 67 counties. And this data doesn't lie. I think that the data showing the polling on the water and the air quality, some of the most important numbers that we have, and we need to share this and push this out and talk about the related, legislation to these things. And from Washington County to Susquehanna County to Bradford County, Tioga to Chester County, people's drinking water supply has been decimated. And there's a reason this is a concern across the whole Commonwealth. And unfortunately, state regulators aren't holding up their end of the deal. And so the people are concerned. This data shows that. We know that from what comes into our inboxes, from people that we don't even represent. But, I think knowing that this has been going on for almost 15, 20 years relative to extraction industry impacting air and water quality, that, to continue to know that this is making people sick and not do anything, our state agencies are failing us. And so we need to push for that. And the Attorney General's, grand jury report really provided some basic recommendations that other states already do that have industry. So this isn't, this massive, shift and shut down everything and have a fear mongering of all the quote unquote jobs that have been subsidized by we the people, and yet we can't drink our water, and our air is filled with pollutants. So, we have to use this data to gain momentum. And I know that some of the people that either staff or senators or reps that are on this call care about this, and I'm glad you're here today. But how do we use this data to get our other, members of the Senate and House to be aware of this, and that their residents too are, they're worried about this, and they should be. And we know that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence at this point and this data shows that people are aware of this evidence and they've been reading it and they've been they're upset about it and concerned. And the impacts of the extraction industry across our Commonwealth are real, and they're from legacy pollution left over even from the coal industry. And as we see what happens with the thousands of permitted well pads that may or may not be cleaned up correctly, you know, we need to do better in demanding accountability from these corporate operators and to restore the ability for our Commonwealth to have clean air and water. So I saw this data with Sam earlier on another call a couple weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago. And I was with another legislator from New Mexico who deals with some of the similar political divisiveness in her state relative to industry and this issue. And I think, again, this isn't about shutting down or banning, and people are supportive of phasing out what's causing harm. And also from the standpoint of, we know that Pennsylvanians care about saving the earth. We're a conservation state. We have wonderful, beautiful, public, parks, and this legacy pollution doesn't have to continue for another generation. I think this data is a great starting point. So thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Jenny and Sam, because, the evidence is in the numbers, and I hope that we can keep building this and even expanding on it with more regional polling that's bigger, because, some people really can't turn away from it then if it's specific to their county or district. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Muth. I will turn it over now to Representative Danielle Friel Otten.
Thank you, Jenny. And I echo Senator Muth in her thank you to Food and Water and to the Ohio River Valley Institute for doing this work. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, a lot of times when we talk about fracking, when we talk about the impacts of climate change, it feels like it's something way out here, but it's actually something that's like right front and center in all of our lives. And it's across Pennsylvania, it's across the country. Just looking at our most recent storm with Ida, Ida went from a Category 1 to a Category 4 storm within 24 hours. And it was because the ocean temperatures were at the temperature of bathwater, which is incredibly uncommon, not normal, and not natural. And that created this situation where, in addition to this horrendous storm making landfall, going from a 1 to a 4, it also gave us very little time to plan. And so that's why we're seeing the devastating impacts we're seeing all across the southeastern part of Pennsylvania. But I can say here in Chester County, we're still dealing with it. I was on the phone this morning with Downingtown Borough, who is still trying to pick up the pieces of what happened, at the beginning of this month. And that trend is going to continue, especially in the Atlantic, as storms travel over the warm and shallow waters of the Caribbean and make landfall here on the East Coast of the United States. But the Gulf Coast of our country has also been dealing with this for well before today. In 2017, the Gulf Coast of this country was hit with Harvey. In 2018, they were hit with Michael, and in 2020, they were hit with Laura. And they've had, as we've seen on TV, and it feels so far away, we've seen the devastating impacts that have happened in our own country. We're also seeing the impacts of migration patterns because of how climate change and extreme weather is hitting places like Haiti. And it's also increasing the scale and intensity of wildfires across the West. The wildfires across the West this year have burned more than 5 million acres so far this year, and that is not what is expected to be the final outcome. There's still more that is expected. And it's also a public health emergency. We're seeing that exposure to extreme weather and heat waves are increasing and exacerbating the effects on cardiovascular and respiratory diseases that contribute to premature death, and very much so here in Pennsylvania. And something that is a huge problem in Pennsylvania, and has become a growing problem, is the increase of spread of insect-borne disease. So we Pennsylvanians know that the deer tick is a teeny tiny little insect that can have big and long-lasting impact on our lives, and many Pennsylvanians are suffering as a result of that. And so, in addition to this being a weather emergency, this being a infrastructure emergency, it's a public health emergency. And I just, this poll demonstrates the collective public understanding of that, and the history of socializing the risks and the impacts of the energy sector and privatizing the profits for corporations. It just perpetuates a legacy of boom and bust economics in Pennsylvania. That's something that we've learned as children about how boom and bust is harmful to our communities, and how we need to create more sustainable economic propositions so that our kids, our grandchildren, our future generations have the ability to thrive here in Pennsylvania, and that we know that we're passing something along to, just knowing that what we're passing along to our children and to our grandchildren and our future generations is something that we can be proud of, and that when we go down in the history books, we were on the right side of history. And, if we think that just, folks in the Southeast who are near the refineries are impacted, and folks out West who are near the extraction are impacted, that's a myth, because as Senator Muth and Representative Innamorato can share with all of us, there's actually a hearing next Thursday. It's really important on the landfills and the leachate loophole. We have, I think, Senator Muth might be able to tell the exact number, but I think it's 17 to 18 landfills throughout Pennsylvania that accept fracking waste.
30.
Which is 30. I thought it was 17. So as this extraction comes out of the ground in Western Pennsylvania, it's traveling across 17 counties, 365 miles of Pennsylvania, through pipeline infrastructure to refineries on the coast. It's also cascading out throughout the Commonwealth. There's probably not an area of the Commonwealth that's not impacted, because that fracking waste is ending up in landfills in all of our communities. And because of the loopholes, the hazardous liquids and the hazardous materials from that fracking waste are leaching into our groundwater. And so this industry has been poisoning groundwater, not just where it's happening, but all over Pennsylvania. And I'm super grateful to everyone who's helped to raise more awareness on that. And also just want to encourage everybody to continue this conversation next week. On Thursday, there will be a policy hearing on the leachate loophole with Senator Muth and Representative Innamorato, and also keep your eyes out in the House for a package of bills that will address the Attorney General's recommendations. And I believe in the Senate, those bills are already introduced and able to be co-sponsored. And I want to thank everybody who spent the time today to listen and to become more informed, because it's more important than ever that we understand this and we can talk about it in a way that's meaningful. So again, just want to say thank you, and pass it back to Ginny.
Thank you, Representative Otten. We will now open the floor to anyone who has questions. If you want to turn on your video and actually raise your hand, I'll look for that. Or at the bottom of the screen, you can use the reactions button and raise your hand that way. Everyone right now is muted. You have the ability to unmute yourself when I call on you to ask a question. So I'm not seeing any questions yet. All right.
Senator Fontana has a question.
Take it away, Senator Fontana.
First, I apologize for being late. My previous meeting got a little long-winded, but I'm happy to be able to join, and Senator Muth was kind enough to text me some information, so I do appreciate it. One of the things I just want to thank you for what you're doing, and the polling one of the main things that needs to be done is to make the public aware, make them understand what's happening here with the fracking, that there is a problem and a major problem, and one that we need to do something about. So we need to define it. We need to define that problem. You know, what is it, and then talk about solutions. And I'm a solutions type of person, so that's where I think we need to get. And folks that, in my view, the regulations aren't enough. They're not, being enforced the way they should be. The oversight's not there. Bigger fines. We have to stop this. We have to find ways to stop it and make it hurt for the ones that continue to do it. I don't know if your polling goes down that road or not, to say, what does the public think should be done for the violators, and how how hard should we be on them, or what those solutions should be. Yeah. So I apologize for not knowing that if it's in there, but I really think we need to, lift that hammer and use it as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Fontana. I think those are great points. And, with respect to the poll, some of the most concrete examples, I think, are coming out of the Attorney General's grand jury recommendations and findings. So, in particular, I think the public feels a high degree of confidence in the Attorney General's office and would like to see more prosecution of oil and gas companies. And again, requiring disclosure of chemical use, conducting comprehensive health reports, and requiring safer transportation of waste. And then in addition, I think a concrete takeaway is the ability to limit financial incentives such as tax breaks and subsidies. So again, a strong majority disagreed with providing fracking companies additional financial incentives. So that's another concrete actionable item. And, in terms of other kinds of regulatory or concrete steps that could be taken, it seems like, one of the major areas of favorability was focusing on cracking down on companies that are not complying with regulations. So we have sort of three separate issues. One is, what are actions that we can take based on the current regulatory and legal framework that we have in place? And I think there's, the public feels, and I would agree that there's still a long way to go in terms of utilizing and really using to the full effect the legal and regulatory landscape that we have. And this poll showed that, 61% of voters agree with that. And then again, I'm excited that there's going to be more information on closing the hazardous waste loophole, because that's one where there's a very specific mechanism that's very actionable and highly favorable across party lines. So that's another kind of specific actionable item.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Representative Daly.
Thank you, Ginny. And Joanne, it's so good to see you. And it's been a long time. But, and I thought this report was really so incredibly positive and heartening. And thank you for sharing it with us. So I have a question though, because I don't know, I guess I'm still surprised at some of the numbers. Can you just talk about how the poll was conducted and in what areas of the state? And just to give us a feel for that also, because that also seems to be something very important.
Yeah. So Data for Progress conducted the survey, and again, it was using a web panel respondents. So we saw that they surveyed roughly 650 likely voters, and the sample was weighted so that it would be representative of likely voters across different demographic considerations like age, gender, education, race, and voting history. And there were 4 geographic breakdowns. So kind of southwestern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, and then statewide. So we were trying to get a sample that would be representative of the population of Pennsylvania based on likely voters. And the margin of error was plus or minus 4 percentage points. So even in many of the results that I shared, if you were to go in one way or another, it doesn't change the top line findings. And there are additional details that are shared in the digital toolkit. So if anyone has, data geeks on your staff who really like to dig into things, we're happy to coordinate with them and to, talk in more detail about that, or put anyone in touch with Data for Progress as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer.
All right. I am Representative Otten.
Thank you, Jenny.
You're
Just
welcome.
piggybacking on Representative Daly's question, Joanne, when you look at the crosstabs of the poll, was there a difference between southwestern Pennsylvania and southeastern Pennsylvania, or any different geographical regions of the state? I know often in our work, it often is like the southeast has a stronger opinion about fracking and environmental issues, and the southwest often has a different opinion. Did you see differences, and if so, can you talk a little bit about it?
So there are always geographic differences, and I can share with you the actual crosstabs document so you can look at that. But what I will say is that the results that I shared are averaged across all of the geographies, so that it takes into account essentially differences among sort of the statewide, the Northeast, the Southwest, and the Southeast. So what we were really trying to do, and what Data for Progress did in their methodology, was to design the survey so that we could get sort of a flashpoint for statewide voters. And so there's more detail about that in the crosstabs document, but while there were some regional differences, the results that I presented are representative of the state on the whole.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any more questions? I'm not seeing any more hands raised, so I will close this off. I want to thank all of you for being here today and for leading on this issue that is so critical to the health and safety and well-beings of Pennsylvanians and the environment. As Joanne mentioned earlier, in the chat, there is a digital toolkit for everyone, and watch for a follow-up email to this briefing, and we will include that toolkit again, as well as some other information. So this ends the briefing, and on behalf of the others, I want to wish all of you a good rest of your day. Thank you.